Okay, welcome everyone to the second day of the Hands-on Agile 2025. Welcome to the afternoon session, and I'm really proud that we can welcome Fabrice Bernhard to this session. Fabrice is not just a successful entrepreneur, a very successful entrepreneur, but moreover, he's also the author of the Lean Tech Manifesto. And he will explain to us what this is all about and how it might help us to move from a concept-based approach to creating value to a more context-based approach creating value. Fabrice, stage is yours.
Thank you so much for inviting me. So yes, to give a bit of context about me, I started my first company back in 2007. It was a very studenty company. It was a website called unmatched.com to help you find the bars and pubs and restaurants where you could watch games in France. And so it took us. We managed to sign like hundreds of clients in the first year, and then realized that the business model we were having was not going to fund us for the rest of our lives. And so that's when we launched our second company, which is Theodo, which is a tech consultancy, and by that time we had some experience in how to build tech products. What we didn't have was actually strong experience in project management and methodology. And there was really a key moment in the history of Theodo, which is when we understood Agile and understood it really profoundly enough to actually then start helping other companies adopt it. And now I think it's time for me to start my presentation. So I'll go quickly on the Agile introduction, but sometimes I'm actually making this presentation to people who've never heard about the Agile Manifesto. And even though that's incredibly surprising to me, these people do exist. But just to give back the context of where we all come from, we come from these early 2000s when success stories in tech emerged, which inspires all. And they were wearing t-shirt, they were playing ping pong, and they had like slides in their offices. And of course, at the time I was a student, so I found that extremely exciting, and that's why I wanted to join the tech world. But they were not just cool and having fun; they were actually incredibly performant. With many examples of these, early startups actually disrupting the industry. Google in media or Amazon retail, etc. And so I really like connect this moment to Agile becoming so popular, because of course everyone was wondering what do they do, and it's about at this time that the different pioneers in software engineering who had thought about how to do software engineering better came together in Utah and managed to kind of identify 4 key values that they had in common in their approach, in their rejection of bureaucracy. And these 4 values, you know them. They're the Agile Manifesto, which capture really well what makes like a team of software engineers so much more performant than what traditional companies were doing. And so since these Google and Amazons and Netflix were all early adopters of Agile methodologies, what people understood was that if you wanted to be as good as them, you had to be Agile. And what does Agile mean? It usually means, being very innovative, and also this autonomy of teams on the ground. And that, of course, are 2 very, very compelling visions, which have convinced most organizations. This is a number I like to use often, but in a Deloitte survey of more than 10,000 HR and business leaders, 94% said that agility and collaboration was critical to their organization's success. So that was in 2017. So really, since 2001, when the Agile Manifesto was created, things have evolved to the point that everybody wants to become agile. And now we're maybe entering a new era and that new era probably started with the second number, which is that in the same survey, only 6% consider that their organization has actually succeeded in becoming highly agile. And so that's what we experienced at Theodo very early on. We realized that in certain contexts, we could do wonders. We built an application for Safran, which is this huge aerospace company in France. So it's not a matter of like the size of the organization. And we managed to build the whole application in 8 weeks. And we were iterating on 1 week sprints, and that went really well. BNP, another example, 6 weeks. And I think from week 3, we were actually releasing each sprint to the end users. So we had very quick feedback, which means that at the end of the 6 weeks, not only had we released the product, but we had adoption that was like way beyond expectations. Because we had built it with of course a product owner who knew really well what they wanted, but also with the end users who had managed to give their input before we had finished. And we had this incredible experience of when you put the client inside the engineering team, it was making wonders. The issue was in different contexts, where you have dependencies on very complicated infrastructures, where you have security issues, you have compliance issues, all these dependencies. Then you can be as agile as you want, and we had such a project with a bank. But the reality is, it took us 18 months to release this small application we had built in production, while ticking all the compliance and security boxes. And clearly this app, the first MVP, we built it in like about 4 to 6 weeks. It was a very simple app. So the real challenge was managing to integrate it with the internal data and exposing it to the internet, which was a huge security challenge. And so we were wondering, okay, Agile can be bring incredible results if in the right context, but when you're on bigger projects, more complex environments, and also if you want to run the whole company as an Agile company, what does it mean? And so when we looked for solutions in the Agile Manifesto, we realized it was not the right source of answers for us, because when you look at it closely, you realize it's really captured what makes one software engineering team very, very performant. But each individual value actually doesn't really apply to a large organization. I think that's a strong enough point in an agile community to like go through it. And to be honest, when the first time I got challenged on that, I was very defensive. I love agile, so I was saying, no, you can't say that. Agile is amazing. It applies to every kind of context. But yes, this idea that the Agile Manifesto doesn't apply to large organizations, I had to be convinced, but I got convinced. So the first one is individuals and interactions over processes and tools. And it's a great value to say to a team, stop trying to put processes everywhere, just communicate, just work together. And it works at a small team, but of course, there's a mathematical issue to that, which is the number of possible interactions grows to the square of the number of individuals. So if you are actually leading an organization of 50 people, 100 people, if you start saying to people, just talk to each other, that doesn't really work. Second one, working software over comprehensive documentation, captures 2 ideas. One is that you should stop writing specifications for months, and one is you should iterate on small increments. And the idea is that by confronting your ideas to reality very often and in small increments, you're going to tackle the quality issues, you're going to tackle the delivery issues. And that is really your experience on the experience we had on decent sized projects. Now, again, I'm going to model software as in a very simplistic manner, but as a succession of if branches where you can go either left or right. And what you see is that really quickly, when the software becomes complex, the number of possible paths in your software is actually exponential. And you reach a stage where even if you add a small increment to the number of possible paths in your software, you're adding actually 1,000 new paths. And in a sense, that's already too much to tackle quality issues or delivery issues just by making the increments small. I hid the bug in the slide. I don't know if you see it. But anyway, that was to illustrate that at a certain size, it's hard to find bugs. Yeah, it's like, I mean, there's a few, but anyway. Third value, customer collaboration over contract negotiation. And that's really one of the values I personally like felt the most incredible, because not only do you like go much faster because, business and engineers talk to each other, but it's also the way you get the most interesting, I find, innovation, because by confronting the challenges that the business has with the challenges that the engineers have, and really talking together on the trade-offs, sometimes you can actually break the trade-off and be like, what? But if that's really what you need, actually I have this super smart idea, which would get you more than you want and faster than you want, and that's really, I think, as an engineer, one of the most exciting moments when you're building something. Now, the problem is, if you have a multi-team project, you can't really put the client in every team. By the way, Pascal is a real client. He was our first client back in 2009. Yeah, the guy with the suit. So problem number one, and problem number two, when Pascal actually grew up and started working in a larger organization, he was not the sole decision maker, and so you have to deal with actually different stakeholders who have different needs that need to be taken into account when building a product. So you end up with the impossibility of actually like putting the client in every team, and the impossibility of actually identifying one true client. And that again means it's saying, okay, let's just collaborate with the customer. That doesn't really work on very large projects. Finally, responding to change over following plans. So the very agile idea that the team on the ground is the best to understand what is happening in the market, what changes are happening, and therefore also the best to react. Makes a lot of sense at the team size, but if you imagine that as a very large organization size, if a team on the ground was able to make the whole organization react, but it would be more like crowd effects, and that would be catastrophic. So the organization has to be a bit smarter than just listen to any random team on the ground. That being said, so now that I've contributed this criticism of the Agile Manifesto, let me be clear. I love the Agile Manifesto, and I love Agile, and of course, our experience with Benoît, my co-founder of Theodo, was that it didn't mean that Agile didn't exist at scale. And just because there were so many organizations that had like Amazon or Google managed to scale super fast and keep this this fast pace of innovation, and also where when you talk to people inside the organization, told you that they had like a decent amount of autonomy, like it hadn't become this like very bureaucratic, just follow the process kind of culture. So we wondered, what do these how do they do it? Like, what do these big tech companies have in common that allow them to keep a form of agility in their culture at scale? And so we found two things. We found two secrets shared among these. One is lean thinking. And I'll give you two, inspiring examples. First one, for me, it was very inspiring, was realizing that Steve Jobs, actually, when he got fired from Apple, so we're talking like late 80s, and started his new company called Next, he got very fascinated by what was considered like at the time like very innovative ways of working in Japan, and this very innovative way of dealing with quality. And so, because he's Steve Jobs, he decided to get coached by probably one of the biggest experts in the world at the time, who was Dr. Juran, who had come back from Japan. And to give you some context, Dr. Juran was one of the two really famous quality management professors that were sent by the US to Japan after World War II to help them on the reconstruction of their industry and their economy. And so these ideas that Juran and Deming, these were the two professors, brought to Japan was really, how to think more scientifically about work. And then they stayed. So not only did they really influence Japanese culture, but then Japanese industrial culture also influenced them. They learned from them. And so you could say that when Juran came back to the US in the late 80s, he was actually probably one of the biggest experts in the Toyota way of working. And he coached Steve Jobs on it. And there's this amazing interview of Steve Jobs in 1990 explaining what he learned from Journ, which is, quite incredible, and really shows you that he had a deep understanding of lean thinking. Deep understanding that he brought back to Apple when he got acquired by Apple and, managed to get the CEO job back. And also that he brought out Pixar. Pixar is also a company that has a lot of lean thinking in their culture. And it's a company that Steve Jobs founded as a side job. So the other company that is very, another tech entrepreneur, very iconic, that really adopted lean thinking is Jeff Bezos. So he discovered lean thinking by reading, I think, The Goal, and then hired Jeff Wilker, who is very big on lean. And then there's an anecdote which is quite interesting, quite telling, where Jeff Bezos is doing his Gemba, so actually going. So they have this amazing culture at Amazon of going to the customer support, a day a year. And he's working in customer support, realizes that a lot of the customer support people identify products with issues. Because after you get 3 calls about a product with an issue, you start understanding that, the product probably has a generic issue. And then you realize that the poor customer support person who has that amazing information can't do actually anything about it. And so, inspired by Toyota, he pushed for the implementation of what he called the big red button. So what, in lean thinking you would call the undone. So this ability for any customer support person to push a big red button to stop the product from appearing on Amazon, and triggering, of course, like a problem-solving exercise by the product catalog manager to understand what is happening. And then he really deployed lean thinking at scale when he hired Marco Netto, who had learned lean thinking at GE. First, the Six Sigma version, and then really like the Toyota version from Nakao-san. And Marco Netto brought Shingujutsu, which is this big lean thinking consultancy, and Nakao-san sensei, let's say, directly coached Jeff Bezos, and apparently delivered on the promise of insulting him, which Jeff took really positively. So anyway, that's the anecdote. But just to say, and so yeah, why am I saying he deployed lean? Because Marco Netto was actually SVP worldwide customer operations. So everything that has to do with logistics and customer operations, Marco Netto was in charge and deployed lean thinking there. Now, here, when I stop here, people who are very big in lean thinking say, okay, fine, you've just, demonstrated that lean thinking is just agile, but, at scale, better. But actually, there was one thing that was really bothering us, because we thought, lean, agile is not just a subset of lean thinking. There are things that are slightly different. There are some companies that are very agile and are also very big on saying that they're not lean at all. And we realized that these companies or organizations had one thing in common, which was really they had a much more modular organization, much more networked organization. And then when you dug a bit deeper into it, we realized that actually this network organization was only possible because of recent digital technologies. So 2 examples here. One is Linux. So Linux, incredible open source project, more than 10,000 or 20,000, I think, cumulated contributors. And, most of them actually do that on their free time. So if Linux had become a bureaucracy by now, most of them would have quit. And so it's very interesting to understand how Linus managed to keep, so Linus, the founder of Linux, managed to keep Linux a very agile organization. And there were really 2 key scaling crises when things started becoming very difficult, and which they addressed in a very Linuxy way. So because there were discussions of adding more middle management and more processes in place. But actually, what they did, the first scaling crisis, what they did is re-architecture completely Linux to make it much more modular. And that's really when they also introduced like the loadable kernel modules. But anyway, there was like a big re-architecture of Linux. And that really helped make the the different modules more autonomous, and therefore the maintainer of a specific module had much more autonomy in making sure that module was evolving and contributing to the bigger picture. And then the second thing they did a few years later, I think that we're talking about 2000, is they realized they had a big issue on the merging of contributions, where there was a bottleneck. Linus Torvalds himself was like reviewing every contribution. And they were wondering how to address that. And what Linus decided at some point was, after testing the solution, was to adopt a tool, actually a technology called BitKeeper, which was really an amazing technology in terms of like version control of code, and which allowed to distribute that versioning much better. And so the merging of contributions could actually be distributed across all the contributors. And that, when there were a lot of like issues around adopting BitKeeper because it was not open source, so a lot of the community was against it, but Linus saw the potential and so adopted it. And what he says is that overnight, all the bottlenecks of merging contributions kind of disappeared and never came back. Now you might wonder, how come, if BitKeeper is such an amazing technology, how come I've never heard of it? So if you've never heard of BitKeeper, it's because the founder of BitKeeper, Larry McVow, at some point there were some issues came back, and he threatened to make it non-free. To which Linus was like, I can't be bothered with these kind of debates. So you know what? I'm going to take 2 weeks off, I think 4 weeks off, and just try to build my own version of BitKeeper. And that's how he built Git, which we're now all using in our tech organization, or at least, probably most of us. I think the adoption of Git nowadays is like 97% or something. So yeah, that's quite a crazy story. And clearly the reason Git has become so ubiquitous is because it's this amazing tool to like allow a more networked organization to function in a software organization. And the second example, decently similar, is Amazon itself. By the time by 2000, when they had grown so fast that they had this huge monolith of code and this like single database, and therefore any contribution to any evolution to the Amazon code was actually a nightmare. And so there were two like kind of very processed approach to that. One was you had like I think a monthly database meeting. So if you wanted to make a change, add a column or whatever to the database, you had to apply, make a request to the data, and that would be reviewed in the database meeting. And if your request was not good, you had to wait the next meeting. And for anything that required kind of transverse contributions from different teams, there was like a quarterly prioritization exercise where you had to do a business case of why your transverse project was like better than others. Of course, by that time, almost all projects had become transverse, and that was very frustrating because either if your project didn't get accepted, you not only didn't get to do what you needed to do for your business objectives, but actually you ended up having to do what some other person wanted you to do. So that was very difficult. And so a lot of talent leaves at this moment, around this time. And so I think the amazing intuition of Jeff Bezos at the time is to say, okay, we don't need more communication between us. We actually need to like really do something quite radical to reduce communication. And that's when they start a complete re-architecture of the Amazon code base to make it a much more service-oriented architecture. And that took a while. But the result, of course, is not only that from then on they managed to scale super fast, but also that this culture of then turning anything they did as a service. So instead of thinking what is the process I should add, but rather what is a service I should offer to the rest of the organization. It was also like the premise of Amazon Web Services and the creation of the cloud. Because all of a sudden this idea that you didn't have to call someone to get a new server racked, but actually you could just like leverage a service yourself was quite new. So anyway, more of a story. The two kind of things we found that the big organization had managed to stay agile at scale shared in common was lean thinking as really a very large body of knowledge extending agile, but also the way they use technology to create more networked organizations. So ourselves as as leaders of a decently fast-growing organization, we've grown from about 10 people in 2012 to 700 people today. We decided to dive very deep into these two topics. So we went to a Velocity conference, among others. I mean, to many tech conferences, but Velocity was probably one of the most inspiring because that's really where you got a lot of the tech giants sharing all their secrets. And then we studied Lean a lot. So we read the books. We did hundreds of Gembas every year. So Gemba is a Lean term to say you go on the ground and you observe what the teams are doing and you ask questions. And we exchanged with peers, and we were lucky in France to have two more very successful startups in the tech scene who also were starting a Lean journey or were on a Lean journey. Misoto.com and Conto. Conto is like a leading European B2B bank, neobank, I should say. And then we learned from some of the best Lean experts in the world. And we even went to Japan 4 times to study Lean at its source. So it's incredibly inspiring. You visit these factories, you see how Toyota is doing things well above anyone else. And it has nothing to do with software, but actually you can start making parallels, and it's always like amazing trips. And we captured all these learnings in a book because we decided that we had reached the stage where we had to share what we had learned. And so this is the book, the Lean Tech Manifesto. And the reason it's called the Lean Tech Manifesto is because we really wanted to build on top of the original Agile Manifesto, which we loved. And also because it all started with this kind of like debate around, the Agile Manifesto is not scalable. And so we were like, well, maybe we don't need to change that much to make it scalable. And, took us quite a few years and to write a book, but here it is. So yeah, if you want to build on the genius of the Agile Manifesto, once you have like this experience of scaling an organization, and having this experience doing it with lean thinking a lot, you realize that the first thing you need to change is you need to reorder customer collaboration and put it first. Well, that's so obvious for me now, but it's very hard when the organization grows. If you want to keep people adding value to the organization while staying autonomous, that requires the North Star of the customer as really the number one thing. And then the second thing is, well, we use lean thinking and our expertise in tech to kind of rewrite every value in something we found was actually true to the spirit of the Agile Manifesto, but applicable at scale. And I'm going to go through all 4. And of course, I'm really happy to answer questions. So the first one, customer collaboration doesn't scale, but value for the customer. So setting a clear North Star around value for the customer and sharing it with the whole organization allows you to, everyone to agree on the shared goal of delivering more value, fighting, the tendency of silos to optimize for their own silo rather than thinking about the customer. And it allows, to also strive to better understand what value means, because actually value for the customer is like something you should be always continuously researching. And then if you clarify it and communicate it across the organization, it helps and design the organization around it. You can actually help every team see how they contribute to it. So concretely speaking, at Theodo, what do we do? Because this is a principle, but what does it mean in practice? Well, for example, I mentioned it, but if you want value for the customer to kind of circulate across your organization, the leadership needs to understand it, and the leadership needs to go on the ground, see how teams are working to really understand what value means in the daily life of the teams. And that this is not only for the leadership team to understand what value actually means, but also sometimes to kind of, have this two-directional exchange on what value means. Second thing, so we created a technology that we call the product architecture, which is a way to visualize all the trade-offs, all the around value that you're facing as a team, as a product team. So the trade-offs between the different stakeholders, the different technologies that you could or functionalities you could build to try to address the needs of the different stakeholders. And that allows the team to have a lot more autonomy on visualizing and discussing all these trade-offs. And the third one is definitely visual management. Because visual management is so powerful in terms of communicating the shared understanding of value across the organization, it's also an amazing tool as a leader to force you to clarify your definition of value. And we were amazing at visual management before COVID. COVID really hit us hard, but we're fighting back, and we're restarting visual management. And I'm happy to answer questions about that actually later if you want. Okay, second principle. Individual interactions doesn't really scale, but you can try to design your organization and use technology to make it a much more networked organization, which means that you will have pockets of teams that will be able to actually follow individuals and interactions locally, and that will be able to contribute to the bigger picture seamlessly, because they will have less dependencies to the other teams, and each team's work will be merged quite seamlessly together. So concretely speaking, there's a huge work in tech, and it's a continuous work to make sure that your architecture is modular and loosely coupled. And of course, there's a lot of body of knowledge in DDD, domain-driven design around that. We like event storming, for example, as a way to visualize how the architecture can be made more loosely coupled. And once you have a more loosely coupled architecture, and you can assign teams to modules and give them full ownership around that, then you start having a much better functioning organization. Second thing, what is now called data products or API products. So this idea of actually putting a lot of energy on the quality of the interface. It's probably something I didn't mention enough. But when Jeff Bezos initiated this huge re-architecture of Amazon, one of the things he put a lot of emphasis on was the quality of the API. And that's because it's good to have a good architecture, but it's even better if the API is so intuitive that you don't need to plan a meeting or whatever to actually leverage another team's service. It becomes much more self-service and self-discovery. And that's true for APIs. It's also true for any kind of data repository where if your columns and your tables and everything is well named, things will be shared much faster, much more efficiently. Finally, and I'm just kind of mentioning it, but this doesn't apply just to tech teams. It also applies to business teams, and typically a self-service data platform where you have all the data of all the organization that empowers any team to analyze the data they need that is relevant to their work. Third, working software doesn't tackle the quality and delivery when it becomes very complex, but here we can leverage the decades of experience of the Toyota production system on how do you produce higher quality while delivering more continuously in general, but in software in particular. And so these two pillars of the Toyota production system that are linked to production are JIDOKA and just in time, or right first time and just in time. So some examples, JIDOKA, so this idea that you implement automated quality checks as early as possible and at every possible step, so you can detect defects as early as possible and reduce the cost of quality. The example here I'm giving is a linter, so you can really detect defects while coding, something that software engineers are quite familiar with. Second thing, Dantotsu, so the systematic analysis of defects. And the idea is that if you analyze defects every day, then you learn so much faster, and you also start seeing patterns that you can address once and for all. And on the delivery side, adopting a real Kanban to visualize lead time and inventory. So I say real because the word Kanban is used a lot in our industry to describe anything that has columns. But if you go back to the roots of Kanban, Kanban is this amazing tool to connect customer needs to the whole organization. And so the idea is you really want to visualize bottlenecks, and you can do that using columns, but you really need three more things. You need one, to visualize the lead time. So the number of days since you started investing in your increment, that is often very brutal, but it's important to see where things are stagnating. You need to see all the places where nobody's working on stuff. In manufacturing, you see a huge pile of inventory. In digital, you need to visualize it that you need to make a dedicated column to waiting. And then the third thing is really like the columns. If you a real Kanban should be about resources, so the columns should be teams, because you should see which teams are overburdened, which teams are underburdened, underutilized, and anything that has to do with workflows, like doing done, that can be internal to the team, but that's not really what you need on an organizational Kanban. And finally, I'm getting a bit faster, building a learning organization over responding to change. You don't want the organization to react to any changes on the ground, but you want it to be smarter. Means you want to learn what customers need, have a much more learning and analytical approach to it, and then make sure that any reaction that you have will be building on existing and new learnings. And then these learnings, of course, will be spread throughout the organization as efficiently as possible. So 3 key things we're doing at Theodo. First, I think the key of all this is cultivating a problem-solving culture. So the idea that, if a team brings up a problem, that's going to be very positive. If a team hides a problem, that will be considered very negative. And so, as soon as you have this culture of bubbling up problems, then of course you detect changes in the market much faster, and you can start analyzing them and decide learning how to adapt. The second thing, once you start learning, you need to create knowledge. So we use the word standards in lean thinking rather than process. The idea is that you're not describing how things should be done, but you're building a training document on how things are usually done, but allowing, of course, people to autonomy on the best way to get things done. These documents usually become obsolete quite fast, so that's where Kaizen, so this idea of taking time to analyze the way you work, and so to realize that things have changed, and you need to refresh your standards. That's really important. These are like really 2 important legs to the idea of creating shareable knowledge. And last but not least, really deploying a culture of continuous training, on-the-job training. So at Theodo, we have a lot of dojos around the things that we consider quite structural to the organization. And what we're trying to do is really to have the culture of skills matrix in the teams, so that the team leader can visualize who needs the training on what, and then depending on what's coming up in the backlog, for example, organize very short half-an-hour trainings here and there. All right, so that was the quick summary of the Lean Tech Manifesto. If you want to know more about this, it's in the book. And I think it's good. And if you want to know more about things we do, because of course the book has been published now, you can also follow me on LinkedIn. I'm trying to write about our journey since. That's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, Fabrice, thank you. I think we have time for one or two of the questions from the Q&A form. So the first one sounds interesting from Gunnar, and means these principles require leadership that either designs the organization like this from the start, or is open to radical redesign. What is your experience in changing a leader's minds or views? Doable, hard, lost cause?
That's a hard one. It is true. There's two aspects to that. First, do you need the CEO? If you want to transform the organization, you need to onboard the leadership team and the CEO in particular, because they're usually the kind of guardians of the culture. So that's true. Can CEOs change? Yes, good CEOs change. I think that's one of the key characteristics. Because I'm talking probably more about entrepreneurs, but I know as an entrepreneur, that your company is only as big as your brain. or whatever. And so you know that every now and then you hit a ceiling that corresponds to your ability. And if you don't reinvent yourself, you're never going to go past through the ceiling and hit the next one. So I think good entrepreneurs are those who are able to reinvent themselves. And that's why there's a lot of entrepreneurs around us that have adopted lean thinking. So that's a optimistic message. Now there's another message, which is, if you're not the CEO, what can you do? And I think this is really where I think we need to see the world as a kind of a negotiation place. And I think there are probably ways to deal with the stakeholders, whatever unit you're leading, and saying, you know, what kind of autonomy do you give me in the way I do things? And what do I need to deliver against that? So you leave me alone. And I've seen that happen. I'm not saying it's easy, but I think it's kind of doable. And then in general, I think the ideas in lean thinking. But what I've seen exactly is people spontaneously starting to do Kaizen, or really learning and teaching problem solving to their team. And these are already incredibly helpful. Will make you stand out. Doesn't mean you'll be able to transform your whole organization into a lean organization overnight, but it will be a first step in the journey. I don't know if I've answered the question, but yeah, I was saying it's not a lost cause. That was my key message.
Thank you.
Okay, there's one short follow-up question that is pointing in the same direction, which is about team topologies. I like how you stress that architecture and networks of teams need to be composed together. How well do you think team topologies is useful here?
So I reference team topology in the book. But I love the word because it's this idea that when you design, so basically the short answer is I think it's very useful. It's understanding that the design of your organization will enable to connect better each contributing team to the bigger picture, to the value for the customer. And I think that's, I like, what Matthew Skelton and Manuel Pais say in Team Topologies. I like what Marty Kagan says in Empowered. I would say Marty Kagan has actually a simpler model, which I think is in a sense more useful for my purpose, which is to say, okay, either a team works for the customer, or it works for the customer through a proxy, or it works for an internal customer. But at the end of the day, for Marty Kagan, there's always you need to understand who your customer is, and I think that's probably what I would recommend, is designing an organization where everybody understands which customer they work for.
Fabrice, thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us and sharing your information. And it's been a great pleasure. And as usual, videos will be available, I think, sometime in March. We'll let everyone know and then publish them accordingly. So everyone who missed today can have the session on YouTube as well. Fabrice, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, everyone.